Welcome back. In today's lecture, we're going to start talking about different ethical engines or different moral theories. And these moral theories are really, they're ideas that are put together, they're designed to try to help individuals make moral decisions. And so when you're given some type of moral conundrum, when you're put into a situation where you have to make a decision, and it is a moral decision, these ethical theories or ethical engines or moral theories, they're designed to try to help the individual to take the situation, to take whatever information it is about the situation that they're in, to put it into the engine or to put it into the theory, and then the theory is supposed to give them the right action, the right way to behave. And so that's why they're a moral theory, because you're supposed to be able to develop or determine how you should behave morally using the guidelines or using the mechanics of these different engines or theories. And so what we're going to start doing now, and I'm certain that I'll be mentioning a foundation again, but now kind of moving away from the foundation and really trying to look specifically at the different moral theories, is kind of where we're at now. And so what are some different ways that individuals have said that we should consider, what criteria should we take into account to consider what would cause an action to be either moral or immoral? And so that's how these theories are going to work. The first one that we're going to look at is called ethical egoism. And ethical egoism is basically the idea that this theory addresses human nature and attempts to reveal mankind is more interested in engaging in self-love and advancement than in advancing even those we care about most, right? And so the idea behind ethical egoism here is that what mankind really cares about is the advancement of the self. Now, ethical egoism, in Greek, the word ego or ego means I. It means I. And so when you put an ism on the back end of it, just like what happens for all of our other isms, is that it becomes a philosophy or a worldview, or in this case, a moral engine. And so what you get is the ethic of I-ness. And so ethical egoism is actually a moral theory that says the best way, the moral way, right? The moral way, the right way, the morally correct way to behave is in a way that promotes the self. And so it's a kind of selfishness that is morally correct. And we'll kind of see why these individuals are saying this is morally the right way to behave. I would assume that most of you were taught, as I was taught, to be selfless and to consider others sometimes or always or at least often above myself, and to make sure that I was not behaving selfishly. But this is a moral theory that goes against that principle that many of my students will certainly have been taught, that says, no, the moral way for you to behave is to behave in a selfish manner. Again, we'll kind of see why. I assume that many of you have not been taught in this way, but we'll see kind of why they're saying that this is the correct way to behave. And so hopefully, even at the end, if you don't agree with the moral theory, you'll understand the moral theory, and it'll help you to begin thinking more and more about your own moral theory and where you stand and why. All right, so egoism, ethical egoism, refers to putting the self, the ego, as the paramount focus. And that word paramount there really just means as the greatest. You know, it's the most important. So you're focusing on yourself as the most important aspect of making moral choices. Ethical egoists only act from self-interest. You behave according to your interest and not to others, right? And so here is a quote from the ethical egoist Gary Hull. Genuine love, here's a quote about love. It says, love, we are repeatedly taught, consists of self-sacrifice. Love based on self-interest, we are admonished, is cheap and sordid. True love, we are told, is altruistic. But is it? Okay, now the word altruistic there means self-sacrificing or self-giving. You're giving up of the self and you're behaving big-heartedly towards other people. That's what it means to be altruistic, is to sacrifice the self in order for others to have to promote the good of others, right? So you're not promoting the good of the self, but you're promoting the good of others, and that's what it means to be altruistic. You're caring about those other individuals. And so here now the quote from Gary Hull: "Genuine love is the exact opposite. It's not altruistic. It is the most selfish experience possible in the true sense of the term. It benefits your life in a way that involves no sacrifice of others to yourself, nor yourself to others." And so another believer in ethical egoism wrote that you should treat other individuals as if they are vampires, right? And so the vampire comes to suck your blood or to take your life. And so other individuals, this is not Gary Hull, it's another individual, another ethical egoist, they say you should treat them like vampires because they're coming in to try to take your time and your energy. They're trying to take away from you, and just like the vampire sucks from you, these other individuals are sucking from you as well, and you should run from them as you would run from a vampire, because you're to care about the self, and you should not allow them to take advantage of you in any way whatsoever. And so here the ethical egoist is saying don't behave in such a way as to give yourself to others, but really focus on yourself. Now one of the most popular, or I would say one of the better known ethical egoists was a lady named Ayn Rand. You may have heard of her. She wrote a pretty popular book called Atlas Shrugged. And so just to mention, so you know that's one of them. I'm not going to spend any time on her, but in case you're interested in this particular topic, she's certainly a good person to take a look at. There are three kinds of ethical egoism. First is what's called personal ethical egoism, and in that, the individual who is involved in that particular type of egoism says, I'm going to act only in my self-interest, and everyone else can do whatever they want. All right, so this person is one who is going to behave according to what's going to bring them what they want, and they don't care how anybody else behaves. Other people can behave as an ethical egoist, or they can behave as a deontologist or a utilitarianist. It doesn't matter to them, right? And so for them, they've made up their minds about themselves, and everybody else can do whatever they want. There's the second kind here is called an individual ethical egoist. And this is the person who says that everyone should act in my interest, right? And so this is different than the first one. The first one said, I'm going to act in my interest, everybody else can do what they want. The second one here says, I'm going to act in my interest, and everyone else should also act in my interest, right? So the distinction in the two. And then the third kind is called a universal ethical egoist. And this is the individual who says that each individual should act in his or her own interest, right? And so the first one said, I'm going to be an ethical egoist, everybody else can do what they want. This one says, I'm going to be an ethical egoist, and everybody else should also be an ethical egoist, right? So I'm going to behave selfishly, and everyone else should do the same thing, right? So rather than leaving it up to them, or rather than other people coming in and trying, like the second one saying, everyone else should come in and serve me. Instead, this third type, this universal ethical egoist, says, I'm going to behave selfishly, and that's morally the right thing to do, and everyone else should behave selfishly, and that's morally the right thing for them to do as well. So that third one is the one that we're going to focus on and think about the most as we move through this particular lecture, and partly that is because this is probably the most popular of these positions. What they're going to say is that everyone does this. Everyone behaves selfishly anyway, right? So that's why we're going to focus on that third type. So everyone, that third type, the universal ethical egoist, says I'm going to behave selfishly, and everyone else should behave selfishly as well. That's the one we're going to focus on. All right, there are at least three principal arguments in support of ethical egoism. So here are three good arguments for why everyone should behave as an ethical egoist, why everyone should behave selfishly. And we're going to go through all three of them. I'm going to list them for you real quickly, and then we're going to go through them in more detail, 1, 2, 3. But here they are just in a quick list. First of all, the first argument for supporting ethical egoism is that altruism is demeaning. Altruism is demeaning. Number 2, acting selfishly creates a better world. And number 3, it doesn't result in such a different world after all. And now we'll pull those apart and look at them in some detail. Okay, so that first one there was altruism is demeaning. So the first argument for universal ethical egoism is that altruism is demeaning. And what this means is that People who behave altruistically, who put others ahead of themselves or above themselves, what they're doing is they're, according to these ethical egoists, they're saying that these individuals are more important than I am. These individuals are more valuable than I am. So I'm going to put them first. And so Friedrich Nietzsche and other philosophers argue that altruism was being demeaning because it meant that an individual was saying that some other person is more important than I am. And so it demeans you. It makes you less than other people because you're saying other people are more valuable, and therefore you shouldn't do it because we're all equally valuable. And instead of behaving in that altruistic manner, we should put ourselves first. Everyone should put their own self first. Nietzsche saw this as denigrating oneself or putting oneself down and putting less of a value on yourself and putting a greater value on others. And so the heart of altruism here for Nietzsche and for others was demeaning. It's putting yourself down. And so you should keep yourself up here and saying, no, I'm just as valuable, I'm just as important as these other individuals. All right, so that's the first argument for universal ethical egoism. The second one here, acting selfishly creates a better world, is the second argument. And there are two different aspects to this particular argument. The first one is what's called an epistemological aspect. Now, epistemology in Greek just means knowledge, or so epistemi in Greek means knowledge. And when you put the ology on the back end of it, then it becomes a study. And so epistemology is the study of knowledge. And so when, in this case, the universal ethical egoist says that acting selfishly creates a better world, what that means is that with this bit of knowledge, we understand that each person, right, this is the knowledge argument for it, each person has the best knowledge of what is best for them, right? So you know best what's best for you. Other people don't know what's best for you. So say, for example, that I tried to behave in your best interest. I couldn't do it according to this universal ethical egoist. I couldn't actually behave in your best interest because I don't know what's in your best interest. Only you have that knowledge. Only you know what is in your best interest. And so if everyone acts in their own best interest, the result is ultimately going to be a better world because each person is going to figure out and know what's best for them as a person, and therefore we're going to have a better world. And so rather than trying to act altruistically and bringing about something that is not best for you, instead bringing about some result that is, say, third best, whereas if I had simply left you alone and let you act on your own behalf, then you would have gotten the best for you, right? So since I don't know what's best for you, I have to let you behave according to what's best for you, and then you'll get the best result for you, and and everybody will get the best result for themselves, and therefore we'll have a better world. Okay? Now that's the epistemological aspect of the second argument that says acting selfishly creates a better world. The second part is the moral aspect of this argument, saying that behaving selfishly creates a better world, right? So morally what's going to happen here is that helping others makes them dependent. And if you'll let them alone, if you'll let them work for themselves, ultimately they're going to become stronger. So if you help somebody, or if you're altruistic towards them, you make them dependent on you, and that makes them weaker. It makes them less of the best that they could be. They're not going to be as strong as they could be, or as smart as they could be, or they won't have achieved as much as they possibly could have achieved. And so in this way, you're actually making them weaker if you help them. And so morally, that's wrong. Morally, it's wrong to make people weaker. What makes people stronger is if you leave them alone and make them become what they can become on their own. Then they get stronger, and that's morally right, is to try to act in such a way so that people will become stronger. So it's wrong to help people because that makes them weaker, but it's right to leave them alone and make them earn it on their own because that will make them stronger. So helping others makes them dependent, and that's going to harm them. So behave selfishly and let other people behave selfishly, and everyone will be stronger for it, and then we'll have a better world because we'll have a world full of strong people, and that's a better world than a world full of weak people. All right, so that's argument number 2, acting selfishly creates a better world. Argument number 3 is ethical egoism doesn't result in such a different world after all. Right now, this is one of the most important arguments for ethical egoism, and the idea here is that this argument presupposes that people in fact act selfishly and are just pretending to be altruistic. They're just pretending to act selflessly. The truth is, they're arguing here, number 3, that everyone does behave selfishly, and they just pretend, or they put on a mask of trying to behave selflessly, but in fact there are no selfless acts, but instead all acts are fully selfish. And so the argument here is that we should admit the truth of this. We should all just admit that none of us are behaving selflessly, that we're all behaving selfishly, admit that truth, and then go on and continue to behave selfishly while acknowledging to everybody else that that's exactly what we're doing, and that's exactly what everybody's doing. And so the argument here is that nobody behaves selflessly. Okay, so at this point, I look out at my students in my class and I say, go ahead, try to name for me some action that you think someone could take that would in fact be selfless, that is not a selfish act. And so almost right away, one of the arguments that I'll get is, a mother who is somehow sacrificing for her children. So say we've got a single mother who's got 3 children, and she's holding down 3 jobs in order to try to make ends meet, and they're barely making it, right? That would seem very selfless, wouldn't it? Like she's putting the children above herself. But the ethical egoist here is going to turn around and say, okay, what is it that the mother wants? The mother wants that her children survive and thrive. And the way that she gets what she wants is she holds down 3 jobs. She's getting what she wants, which is ultimately selfish, not selfless, because what she wants is for her children to survive and thrive. That's selfish. She's getting the thing that she wants most by doing what she's doing. She's not behaving selflessly in order to help her children. She's behaving selfishly because what she wants is her children to survive and thrive, and therefore she's behaving selfishly, not selflessly. So that's one that I almost always get, something like that, some type of mother example. Another type of example that I get all the time is, say, a soldier. And you've got this soldier, and the most common one I get is the one who throws himself on a grenade, right? So imagine that you've got some type of foxhole or some type of building that a group of, say, 10 soldiers are in, and the enemy throws a hand grenade into, I'm just going to stick with the building, into this building, and that one of those 10 soldiers, one of them throws themselves belly down on a grenade. The idea here is that the soldier will sacrifice himself, only one of them will die, instead of when the grenade explodes, many of them will die or many of them will be injured, kind of depending on the room and the dimension and all these things. But they're trying to save their fellow soldiers, and they're doing that by sacrificing themselves. That would seem very selfless, wouldn't it? The trouble here is that the ethical egoist will reply, okay, well, what is it that the soldier wanted? Well, the soldier wanted that his fellow soldiers did not become injured or die, and so instead of behaving selflessly, his act was selfish because what that soldier wanted was for his fellow soldiers to survive or not be injured. So he got what he wanted because, and therefore he behaved selfishly. He behaved selfishly because throwing himself on the grenade got him what he desired most. What he desired most was that these other soldiers not become hurt, which means that he was selfish. He got what he wanted more than anything else, which was that these other soldiers not become hurt. And that's a selfish action. Why? Because he got what he wanted, which is ultimately what selfishness is. And so with the soldier example, with the mother example, you can give examples like, what about somebody who has a great amount of wealth and they give away all this money to help other individuals that they don't even know, right? They've never met them. It's not a mother situation. It's not a soldier situation. These aren't people that they know or love. Same thing. The same thing can be pointed to, and you can look at them and say, well, what is it that you wanted? What you wanted was that that lots of people were helped out of poverty, and so you got what you wanted because you gave a bunch of money to these individuals that ultimately pulled them out of poverty. Therefore, you are selfish. You're not selfless. You're selfish because you got what you wanted. Ultimately, you got what you wanted, and that's selfishness. And so any scenario, and I've had dozens and dozens of these things thrown at me, ultimately all of it comes back to this individual got what they wanted, and if they got what they wanted, they behaved selfishly. And there really isn't a scenario that you can throw out that can't be spun back into this idea of selfishness. So then, is it really true that all of us just behave selfishly, right? It seems like that might be the case, but is it really the case that all of us do, in fact, behave selfishly? Well, the ethical egoist is going to say here, the universal ethical egoist is going to say here, well, yes, that's exactly the way all of us behave. We behave selfishly, and we should just admit it and therefore go on, because that's going to be the best for each and every one of us. We can lose our hypocrisy and we can just say, this is truly how we behave, so go ahead and behave in that way. Now, thinking about it here, thinking about this third argument, thinking of a couple of examples, and then kind of trying to pull some of this apart and say, is this really the case? Okay. Would the committed ethical egoist, the universal ethical egoist, doubt that the Dalai Lama or Bishop Desmond Tutu or some other apparent saint really wasn't behaving altruistically? Would we really look around at some of the true saints, those individuals who really do seem to have behaved the best of us, who seem to have sacrificed so much in order to gain something that was greater than themselves, so that somehow made better other people's lives? Would the true ethical egoist really say that those individuals were just behaving selfishly? If so, we have to question whether psychological egoism is a genuine empirical belief or if it's really something that's unfalsifiable, right? And so the key here is really going to be whether or not something is unfalsifiable. Now, what does it mean for something to be unfalsifiable? Hopefully you remember a little bit about this idea from Karl Popper from your philosophy class if you took one. But basically the idea here is that if something's unfalsifiable, it's something that you can't show to not be true. Okay, so for example, you can't prove that the sun will rise tomorrow. It might be the case that today is the last day that we all have here on this earth with our particular star that we call the sun. That might be the case. In fact, you can't prove that today isn't the last day that the sun will shine. In fact, you can't prove that the sun didn't wink out of existence 8 minutes ago, because it takes 8 minutes for the light from the sun to get here to our planet. So you can't even prove that the sun is still as it was 8 minutes ago. You can't prove that. So it's something that you couldn't. It's something that you can't prove false. You can't show that that the sun really truly is still there. You can't show that that's not the case. And so what Popper here is saying is that there are some things that you can't prove, but ultimately it doesn't mean you have to believe that or even to be worried that these things might be the case. And so, for example, sticking with the sun as an example, we shouldn't be worried that the sun isn't still there. Why not? Because the sun's been there for how many ever hundreds of thousands or millions or billions of years, however long ago it formed up. And it's always been there, and it's always been doing what it's been doing for the last whoever knows how long. And so we don't have to worry. It's logical for us not to worry about that the sun is still there or not, as opposed to to worrying about it and saying, well, we can't know, and therefore we should doubt that the sun is still there. It's more logical to think that it is there, Popper says. And so if we take a look at this ethical egoism, if we take a look at that theory, it really seems to be more of a theory that can't be proven false. That doesn't mean it's true, it just means that you can't really prove that it's false. And I want to use another theory to try to kind of help you see, because I think that one is a little more clear as far as understanding of why it can't be proven false. If we take Freudian theory, for example, and within Freudian theory, what he says is that everything that you do is motivated by some type of sexual motivation, right? And so it doesn't really matter what it is that you're doing. Your motivation is sex, and often it's going to be sex towards, say a parent or something like that, right? It's one of the more popular ones that, that all males desire to have sex with their mother, is kind of that Freudian thing. And so what Freud does is, when he sets up this particular theory, he says, well, everything you do is motivated by sex. And then, someone might bring to him a scenario where it doesn't seem that sex is obviously or overtly the motivation for the action that's been taken. And what Freud says is that, well, you're just repressing the sexual drive in that case. And so if your motivation is driven by sexual if your action is motivated by sexual orientation or by some type of sex drive, then Freudian theory is proven true. And on the other hand, if you're repressing sexual urges, then and that's what's the motivation for those actions, then again, Freudian theory is proven true. And so it doesn't really matter what scenario you bring to Freud. He's either going to say this is sex is your motivation, or you're repressing sex. And so it doesn't matter what the scenario is, he's going to win. He's going to be able to say, see, that was your motivation, or see, you were just repressing your motivation. And so he sets up a scenario here where he seems not to be able to lose, but does that really mean that all activities are driven by sexual motivation, or does it mean that he simply set up a scenario which can't be proven false? That doesn't mean that it's true. It just means that it seems like, at least on the surface, that you can't prove that one of these that this theory is necessarily false. But that doesn't mean that all motivations are sexual. It just means he set up his scenario in a very clever way, and perhaps it can't be falsified. Again, that doesn't mean it's true. It just means that it can't be falsified. It seems that we kind of have something here in the same category with this idea of ethical egoism, and all actions are in fact selfish. Part of the reason that this is a very clever way of setting these things up is that it's impossible for a human to go in and act in a scenario, in a situation, devoid of themselves. You can't perform an action without yourself being part of the action. So what's going to happen is that the ethical egoist is always just going to point back at the self and say, see, you were involved, therefore it was selfish. It's not the case that just because you're involved in every scenario that you are acting within, and it's impossible to avoid that, it's not true that just because you're acting in every situation that necessarily, therefore, you are selfish in every situation. It's just true that you can always point back to you were part of the action, but that doesn't mean you were necessarily selfish. It just means you were part of the activity. And so it becomes one of those things that looks like it might be true, but in fact, it's just that we can't necessarily falsify it. We just can't say that, well, this is untrue because of ... reasons. And so it's really just set up in a very clever, I like to call it word magic type situation, just like Freud set up his situations, and it seems like it might have some type of truth or validity to it, when in fact it's just simply set up very well so that it doesn't seem like, or so that you can always point to some type of escape clause or some type of escape plan. And so it's this idea of bending and twisting scenarios back and pointing at this and saying, and therefore, in fact, this is the motivation that everyone has. Just because that's the motivation that we have in some situations, that doesn't mean that that's the only motivation that there is. So when we get to the weaknesses of this particular theory, we're going to see that there's 5 weaknesses, and when we get to the 5th one, I'm going to dwell a little bit more on this particular idea. And so I kind of want to stop it here and just say, we'll come back to this idea, and we'll address this a little bit more when we get to the very end of this lecture as well. But for now, just kind of keeping in mind this idea of falsifiable versus unfalsifiable, and setting up these scenarios in very clever ways doesn't make them true. It just means they're set up in very clever ways in this particular case. We'll see a little bit more as we get to the end. Now, having said that, that does bring us to the 5 weaknesses of ethical egoism. And I want to list those 5 quickly, and then we'll pull them apart and look at each of them in turn. So the 5 weaknesses of ethical egoism are: it would be a difficult position to proclaim in public. It would mean that the world is full of strangers. It would be hard to imagine that there's such a thing as love or friendship. It would make individuals morally insensitive. And finally, a single act of altruism would disprove ethical egoism. And so, looking here then at the first weakness of ethical egoism, the first weakness is that it may be difficult. It would be a difficult position, a difficult theory to proclaim in public. That is to say, it wouldn't be one that the adherents of this particular theory could necessarily run around proclaiming to others, because if you proclaim to others, hey, I think everybody behaves selfishly and so I'm going to behave selfishly, people are going to probably shun you and not make you part of their group, because it's not something that humans really accept readily into their groups, is people who are overtly, meaning often and almost always, behaving in a selfish manner. We want to attach ourselves in our social circles with individuals who will both give and take. We understand that that's part of the scenario. And so what we see here is that it would be a very, very difficult thing for people to proclaim in public. While they could, it might not be prudent for them to do that, because we live in a culture that values altruism. Persons might become suspicious and distrusting of them. You're not going to trust somebody who goes around and says, I'm always going to behave selfishly. Why not? Because you know that they're going to abuse and use you. Also, having to hide one's ethical code makes the code look suspicious in and of itself. And so one of the difficulties here that they're going to face is that they can't proclaim it, because that's going to make people suspicious of them, but they also can't hide it, because if they hide that, then that also makes them look suspicious as well. And so you kind of can't win if you run around telling everybody this is your code. They're not going to want you as part of their group. And on the other hand, if you try to hide it, then they're going to be distrustful of you as well. And so the idea of it's a difficult thing to proclaim in public is the first weakness of ethical egoism. The second weakness of ethical egoism is that it presupposes a world of strangers who are indifferent to one another. Here, what we see is that some philosophers have argued that ethical egoism is, at best, appropriate to living in a world of strangers that you do not care about. And so if it is the case that you live in a world where everyone really is a stranger to you and you care about no one, well, that might be something that the ethical egoist could then proclaim and say, yes, this really is the way it is. But it seems to run counterintuitive to our everyday experiences. And what that means is that what we see instead of ethical egoism is we really do see people who sacrifice in the face of danger and difficulty, and who really do seem to give of themselves, sometimes to strangers, sometimes to your family. And honestly, if you think about it for a moment, it is honestly more difficult sometimes to sacrifice yourself for your family, for your loved ones, than it is to sacrifice for strangers. Sometimes it's easier to walk up to somebody on the street and help them in some way, like say help them change a tire or whatever. That it might be easier sometimes to sacrifice for that person because you don't know what a jerk they are. On the other hand, if you live with people all the time, if you have intimate relationships with individuals, sometimes it's harder to sacrifice for those people, partly because you have probably also sacrificed for them before and again and again and again. So sometimes it's easier to sacrifice for strangers than it is to sacrifice for those that we genuinely care about, that we have in our intimate relationships. But here in this particular one, they presuppose that the world really is a bunch of strangers that we don't care about. And we know that that's not the case. We have experiences where there are individuals that we care about, that we want to see succeed, that we put our weight behind and we help push them as much as we can because we want the best for them. And so rather than living in a world full of strangers where we are indifferent, we have the opposite experience where, in fact, we live in a world that is filled with personal relationships and individuals that we do, in fact, care about. And so it seems to run counter to our intuition. It seems to run counter to the fact of that, well, we have these experiences. And I know we haven't talked about William James, but one of the William James and his arguments for pragmatism is that a person with an experience always has a trump card to someone who has a theory. And so a personal experience is always going to trump, is always going to be more powerful than somebody who has a theory. And so if you've got a personal experience of living in a world that's not simply full of strangers, that's going to be more powerful than an individual who's got a theory. And what that means here, I'm going to give you kind of an easy example to hopefully help you kind of pull that through with James, right? A person who has an argument that there are only white swans is always going to lose to a person who has an experience of having seen a black swan, because this personal experience is going to trump the theory of swans are only white. And so if you've got a personal experience, then someone who walks up to you and begins to make an argument against some personal experience that you've had, well, they're going to be hard put to convince you the opposite of your experience. Now, James was not saying, and I'm not saying, that all experiences are necessarily true, because people have certainly been delusional before. And so it's not necessarily the case that that experience always wins, because a person could have thought they had an experience that in fact did not happen to them. That's certainly the case. But James is going to say the experience trumps. Experience trumps an argument. And so in this case, is it really true that we do live in a world that's filled with strangers where we're indifferent? Or is it really the fact that we do live in worlds where we have personal relationships and we really do care about these people? Which is the case? All right, so the third of the 5 weaknesses for ethical egoism is that it's difficult to imagine love or even friendship from an altruist's standpoint. That is to say, if the ethical egoists are right, can we really have friends, or can we really love people? If friendship involves, among other things, being concerned about other people and for their own sake, then this seems to be something that's beyond the reach of an ethical egoist. And so that ethical egoist is always going to have to believe and always have to behave selfishly, which means that according to our definition and understanding of true friendship, there's no such thing as friendship, because you can't genuinely care about and want that another person succeeds, and that the best happens to them and for their sake. You would have to want that the best happens to that person and that they succeed for your sake, but it can never be for their own sake. It would have to be everything is about me and what helps me to get what it is that I want. So ethical egoists can help their friends, but they could only help their friends if they believe that there is some type of long or short term, it doesn't really matter, but there's got to be some type of payoff that is equal to or greater than the effort that they're putting in. Remember the vampire, right? So you might let the vampire suck your blood, but only if you know that somehow in the long term that scenario is somehow going to be an equal win for you, or even a greater win for you as an ethical egoist. And so it would be hard to imagine that the ethical egoist can truly have friends, because they could never allow themselves to sacrifice, and that they could never truly be involved in a loving situation, because love seems to, at least according to the classical definition, it really does involve sacrifice of the self. And so they wouldn't be able to participate either in friendship or in love. That was number 3. So number 4 of the weaknesses for ethical egoism. Egoist could seem to be morally insensitive, that they would be morally insensitive. Such sensitivity seems to presuppose caring about other people and for the other people's sake. Moral sensitivity presupposes that the suffering of others exerts a moral pull on the individual, and that's something that the ethical egoist does not and could not recognize. And so what that means is that in order to behave altruistically towards another person, and therefore perhaps to help them morally, so you would have to somehow be sensitive to the fact of that this person is suffering. So imagine that you do see a mom who's stuck in a rainstorm with a flat tire, and she's holding a crying baby, and she's trying to fix a tire, right? And it's raining on her. She can't put the baby back in the car, just for whatever reason. She's trying to hold the baby. It's raining like crazy. She's trying to change a flat tire. The ethical egoist would only be able to help this person if they thought there was going to be some type of payoff on the back end, where someone who might be morally sensitive to this scenario might look at it and say, oh my goodness, look at how miserable that person's condition is, And that sensitivity might then pull on their heartstrings and allow that they could go out there and help that person change that tire. That can't be something that an ethical egoist would allow to happen. It couldn't happen to them because they can't be morally sensitive. They can't be sensitive to the fact of another person's suffering. The only time they could be sensitive to the fact of another person's suffering would be if they understood that that sensitivity might get them some type of payoff in the long or short term. And so they're not going to be able to be sensitive or to necessarily care about other people and the suffering that those individuals are going through. They are morally sensitive about their own position and could be understood as being less delusional than others who believe they are altruistic. Remember that first part of the argument, right? Everybody's behaving selfishly, and that selflessness isn't a delusion. However, they are insensitive in that they believe it is up to everyone to raise their own position with no help from others. Remember us talking about how it just weakens people. So really, if you help that woman there in the rain with a crying child fix her tire, you're not going to make that woman stronger. You're going to make her weaker. And so the right thing to do is to leave her out there. Since that's true, they are going to be insensitive towards other people, toward the woman with the baby and the tire. They're also going to be insensitive towards things like world hunger, where they're not going to want to or even attempt to or care about trying to help other individuals. Rather, they're going to say they should go and somehow get food on their own, because that's what's going to make those individuals stronger, and it's right to have people who are stronger in the world, and they are not going to concern themselves with the fact of that maybe there's a drought that is going to make it impossible for these individuals to somehow acquire or grow food. And so they're just going to be insensitive towards other individuals, and so it's a morally insensitive position. Okay, the fifth one, and I think probably the most important of the five, that's why I left it on as number 5. I think this is going to be the most important aspect of showing that ethical egoism has got some big problems. So the fifth weakness for ethical egoism is that even one act of altruism would disprove ethical egoism. Altruism means people benefit others without an obvious payback. You give of yourself without some type of short or long-term gain, right? For example, a man might donate anonymously to charity and never expect any recognition or personal benefit in return. So we do see individuals who do in fact give money without anyone ever knowing who gave it. And so there might be this large sum of money that goes out and it helps lots of people. Not only do the people who receive the money, not only do they not know who gave it, but even the friends and relatives of the individual that did the giving, even they don't know it. So he never receives any recognition or any kind of applause. Imagine seeing a child who has wandered into the path of an oncoming vehicle. A woman tries to save that child at considerable risk to herself. Now, if she doesn't know the child, if it's not her child or something like that, that seems like a truly altruistic act. That there's a child out here, it's not a child that they know, but they try to save the child. Why? Because they're putting the needs and the goods of that child above the needs and the goods of themselves. And so here with this fifth weakness, what we see is that there really do seem to be actions and activities that are that go beyond selfishness, that really are altruistic. Now, I could take either of those scenarios and I could spin them back into a way of saying, no, they really did get what they wanted and therefore they were selfish. But the point of this particular argument is that in all of human history, in every single act, the ethical egoist, the universal ethical egoist, has to declare that every single act that every single human has ever taken for all time was ultimately selfish. Every single one. It's a difficult thing to imagine that every single action that has ever taken place has always been selfish. When we look at the expanse of the experience and the activities that humanity has gone through, what we're going to find is that it just seems like over and over and over and over again, humanity surprises itself and does seem to behave heroically and selflessly again and again and again. And the universal ethical egoist has to say, that's never true. Never, not one single time has any human ever behaved selflessly. I think that's quite a difficult position to try to maintain. That ever, not one single time. That maybe the majority of our actions are selfish. Maybe that would be a position that would be tenable, meaning it'd be a position you might actually be able to stand on, but that there's never been a single selfless act, not one single time throughout all of human history. It seems a difficult place to position yourself. And if one single action has ever been selfless, then ethical egoism has been proven false. With those 5 difficulties, I think that ethical egoism is, it's going to find itself in quite a difficult predicament. But as I've told you before, and as we'll see as we go through all of these different moral theories, that all of them have weaknesses, and all of them have some type of difficulty that's going to make it hard for it to simply stand on its own. I think it's important that we look at ethical egoism and we understand what it does bring to the table, because it really does help us to see that there is a large degree of selfishness that each and every one of us certainly are involved in when it comes to our activities. And I think it's important for us to know that, for us to recognize that, and to somehow benefit both ourselves and to go on and benefit others with the simple fact of that, yeah, we do often behave selfishly, and it might not be a bad thing that we do in fact behave selfishly, because we need to take care of ourselves. We need to take care of ourselves so that we can continue to take care of others. When a plane begins to crash and the oxygen masks fall from the ceiling, what are the instructions? The instructions are, first put on your own mask, then help your child. Because if you try to put the child's mask on first, and you don't get it on that child, and then you pass out, both you and the child are going to die. But if you'll help yourself, sometimes you'll live, you'll be able to breathe long enough to help someone else as well. So is selfishness part of the equation of morality? Absolutely. It's really important that each and every one of us does value ourselves enough that we don't simply and always allow others to take advantage of us, that we do value ourselves and we take care of ourselves. But is that the any and the only part of moral decision making, that we always value ourselves? And that seems to be where the ethical egoist misses the mark. They seem to say that the only piece of the equation is selfishness. But is that really the only piece of the moral equation, or is there more to the equation? Is it really just that selfishness is the only aspect, or is there more of an aspect to morality than just behaving selfishly? And so I think that's where they miss. They took one piece of the equation and they said, this is all that matters, when in fact there are more pieces to the moral equation than just selfishness, and therefore we need to take those into account as well. We need to see the whole equation, not just one piece of the equation. And I think that's going to be true for multiple of these moral theories as we go through. Deontology is just going to look at duty. Utilitarianism is just going to look at the consequences, the results. Right? So as we go through this, they're each going to pull out one aspect and say, this is the part that matters, perhaps only matters or matters the most, and therefore that's why we behave this way. And I think that's the mistake that many of these things make. And so we'll kind of see that as we go through them. Ethical egoism is a good example because it shows very blatantly that they've taken one portion of this equation and they've said that's all that matters. And so it's very, very helpful for us as we begin to move forward. Hopefully, as you're looking at ethical egoism, you'll begin to see the importance of selfishness when it comes to moral decision making, but that you'll also begin to see that there might be more to it as well. And so as we move forward into the next lecture, we'll be talking about another moral theory next time, and I will see you then.